Hey guys, and welcome back. All right, so we're going to be talking about solving the quadratic equation by factoring. So previously we've been doing these with the quadratic formula, setting it equal to 0, and using the formula. Now we're going to go back to factoring. So very quickly, and we've talked about this already. Okay, so if you look at the first warm-up question, if you consider the equation 3 times x equals 0, for what value of x will this be satisfied? So what only value of x can we plug in here when x equals 0? This is using the zero product property. So the zero product property says anything you multiply by 0 is going to end up in 0. Okay, so if we look at question 2, 4 times 0, again, that's going to be 0. Anything times 0 is 0. Again, anything times 0 is 0. Anything times 0 is 0. So the zero product property states that multiplying a number by 0 is going to equal 0. So how can we use this to solve quadratic equations? Well, if the product, so if we multiply two factors and it equals 0, then at least one of the factors must be 0. Okay, one of these factors must equal 0. So let's take a look at the questions below. And this is all on page 10. So if we look, and you guys already started doing these, I have x times x minus 3 is equal to 0. We're going to t-chart this and solve. So we set both of these factors equal to 0 and solve for x. And you'll find that x equals 0 and x equals 3. All right, so why don't you give question number 2 a try if you want to pause the video here and give this a shot. Again, you're just t-charting, setting them equal to 0. Did you get the same answer as me? We should have gotten x to equal -4 and x to equal 1/2. Again, t-chart those factors, set them both equal to 0. Okay. So let's take a look at the bottom here. For questions 1 through 6, we're going to solve each of the quadratic equations, and we're going to do it by factoring. So very first step, you always need to get the equation in standard form. Okay, standard form, a is out front with the x squared, b is attached to x, plus c, which is our constant, equals 0. Then we are going to factor the expression, set each factor equal to 0, because again, we're solving for the roots. So we're solve for the roots, or the zeros. Okay? And we are solving the equation. So let's take a look at that first example here. I have x squared minus 4. And you guys got to think back to that poster. Is this a binomial? A trinomial? What's going on here? There are two terms. So this is a binomial. There's an x squared, so we know this is quadratic, has even exponents. There's subtraction in the middle, and this is a perfect square of 4, so we can do dots. So we're going to double bubble. I've got x out front, and we know the square root of 4 is 2, and don't forget with dots, one gets a plus, and one gets a minus. And now from here, even though I factored it, I now need to solve for the roots by t-charting. So why don't you try to finish this up? All right, and we should have gotten x to be -2 and x to be +2. All right, so let's move on. So for question number 2, and now this is on page 11, okay, so I want to factor. Again, we're solving for the roots. It's set equal to 0 already, so that's good. Again, this is a binomial, so we have to think, is this dots? Well, let's see. Are these both perfect squares? 25 and 16 are both perfect squares, yes. So perfect squares checks off. Is there subtraction in the middle? Yes. Okay, we have subtraction in the middle. We have two terms and even exponents. So this is dots. We're going to be able to do dots on this. Even exponents, two terms, and subtraction in the middle, perfect squares. Awesome. So let's factor. Double bubble. We know the square root of 25 is 5. we have the square root of x squared is x. And don't forget, with dots, we get a plus and a minus. And then we know the square root of 16 is 4. So now we're going to t-chart. So again, if you want to pause the video here, we're just going to t-chart this. So why don't you go ahead? We're setting them equal to 0. Okay, and this is what your answer should look like. You should have x to equal -4/5 and x to equal +4/5. All right, so I'm going to take a look at questions 3 and 5. And if you want extra practice, you can complete question 4 on here as well. So let's take a look at question 3. So again, is it in standard form? Does it look like ax squared plus bx plus c? And is it set equal to 0? Yes, it is. So we can factor this. Now we got to check what's going to multiply to +14, but is going to add to -9. So let's think. What's going to multiply to +14, but adds to -9? Because we're going to double bubble this. Why are we going to double bubble this? Because the leading coefficient is 1. So we're going to double bubble because the leading coefficient is 1. We don't need to multiply to the back and split the middle. That is not necessary here. So we just got to think. What's going to multiply to 14 but add to -9? So let's think. We got 7 and 2. Okay, well 7 times 2 is 14. But if I add those together, I get +9, and I want a -9. So let's think then. What about -7 and -2? -7 times -2 is +14. Add them together, you get -9. So that works. Those are our two factors. So now that we factor this, you can t-chart, set equal to 0, and solve for x. So again, if you want to pause the video here and try this on your own. All right, and your solution should be x equals 2 and x equals 7. All right, let's continue to move on. Let's go to question number 5. Okay, so for question number 5, we should immediately recognize this is not in standard form. In order to solve a quadratic, it needs to be equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract over 12 on both sides. So let's subtract 12 here and subtract 12 here. Now, this -12 cannot combine with any of these terms because they are not like terms. So I'm just going to rewrite. I have 3x squared minus 9x minus 12 equals 0. The very first thing you should always look for when you factor is what? GCF. Very good. So I'm going to factor out the GCF. Now, here's the important piece to pay attention to. I'm going to factor everything out by the GCF. Everything. Even the equal sign, because what I do to one side, I have to do to the other. All of these terms share a 3. So I'm taking out a 3 on everything. Because I'm dividing everything out by 3, you do not need to bring the 3 out front like we normally have. Again, I'll say that one more time. Because we are factoring everything out by 3, you do not need to bring out the 3 out front. Okay? So let's actually factor this. So I'm taking out the 3. 3 divided by 3 is 1. And I have an x squared. -9 divided by 3 is -3. The x comes down. -12 divided by 3 is -4. And 0 divided by 3 is 0. Now I have a nice trinomial, because there's 3 terms, that I can factor. How am I going to factor this, though? Is the leading coefficient equal to 1? It is. So I'm going to double bubble this. Let's double bubble. What multiplies, and always your x's are out front, what's going to multiply to -4, but add to -3? So you guys should be thinking, if I want to multiply to a negative number, okay, so if I want to multiply to a negative number, one of the signs has to be positive, the other sign has to be negative. So I'm going to write that down. Okay, so I wrote that over here for you. When you multiply to a negative number, you should already know the signs in between have to be plus and minus. because a positive times a positive is a positive. A negative times a negative is a positive. The only combination that's going to get you to a negative number is 1 plus and 1 minus. Okay, so I already know one's going to be plus and minus. So let's think. What's going to multiply to negative 4 but add to negative 3? And the only number combination that we can come up with is either negative 4 and negative 4 and positive 1, or positive 4 and negative 1. So let's think. Which one is it going to be? Because we're multiplying to negative 4. Well, negative 4 times 1 is negative 4. Add these together. Do I get negative 3? You sure do. So I should have plus 1 and minus 4. And now we're going to t-chart this. So if you want to pause the video here and let's do the t-chart method. Okay, and you should have gotten x to be negative 1 and x to be negative 4. Okay, and as always, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to message me on Remind. You can also email me and message me on Unified Classroom. All right, otherwise I'm just going to keep going through these. If you are already, pretty confident and satisfied with this, you can pause the video and work on other problems yourself, or you can just continue to follow along. All right, so we're going to take a look at question 6 on page 11 now. So we have Mr. Hill's science class launched a toy rocket from ground level with an initial velocity of 60 feet per second. Height is represented as h, and t is representing time in seconds. And we're given the following equation. We want to know at what time will the rocket hit the ground. So you guys got to think. What's the height of something when it hits the ground? What's ground level? When height equals 0. Good. When height is 0, that's ground level. So you should immediately be thinking, well, a rocket makes that kind of shape, right? If I'm going to reach the ground level, that's our x-axis. We're solving for the roots. We want to find out at what time does that thing hit the ground. So let's write out our equation. We have h of t is equal to 60t minus 16t squared. Now, I'm going to change this up. I want to do this with the quadratic formula. So let me write that here on the side for you. So I want to solve this with the quadratic formula. If you remember, in order to use the quadratic formula, we need to be in standard form. This is not written in standard form. We need to have it as ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Okay? Well, we got to switch the order of these two things. Because again, I need that t squared out front as per my formula. X would come next, or we're using the variable t here in this case. So let's rewrite. I have h of t equals negative 16t squared. Now remember, there's a little plus out front here of that 60t squared. So we have plus 60t. Okay? So all I did was just rearrange. The negative 16t squared comes out front as per our standard form. And the positive 60t comes after it. All right, now we want to solve for the roots. So whenever I solve for the roots, you got to remember, we always set our equation equal to 0. All right, so now that we've set this equal to 0, we need to identify our a, b, and c values. So a, remember standard form, we have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So if we look at the formula, we can see that a is negative 16. It's the number in front of the x squared, or t squared in this case. B is 60. It's the number attached to x. And wait a second. I don't see that c value. If you don't see it, guys, it's 0. There is no constant, so our c value is 0. So now all we're going to do is plug a, b, and c into our quadratic formula. So if you want to pause the video here and start to do that on your own, I'm going to set you guys up with what I always want to see. I always want to see you guys using parentheses for every variable. So let's do that. Okay, so what I have here in blue is what you should immediately write. Again, you guys will have this formula. You don't need to memorize it. But you should be writing everything that I just wrote here with all the parentheses, and then you're going to fill it in. So why don't you give yourself a few seconds and fill that formula in. Okay, now, you cannot, if you remember from class, you cannot type this entire thing into the calculator. There is no plus minus button. You are typing only what is underneath the square root. That's it. Just what's underneath the square root. Do not include the square root. So when you put that in your calculator, you should get, once you type this underneath the square root in your calc, you should get this 3,600. Okay? So now from there, well, let's check. What is the square root of 3,600? See if it works out nice. Let's see. If I put this in my calc, and I'm running out of space, so I'm going to write this down here. I have x equals negative 60 plus and minus. Now, you are not going to write square root again. This would be wrong. There's no square root here. You're taking the square root of 3,600, which when you plug that in the calc, the square root of this whole thing is 60. So I'm going to put that all over that negative 32. Okay, now if you remember, we need to split it. We have a plus and we have a minus, which is why we need to split it. So I'll have x equals negative 60 plus 60 all over negative 32. And I have x equals negative 60 minus 60 all over negative 32. And you should be using your you should be using your alpha y equals enter button. Okay, so when I put this in the calc, I'll get x to equal 0, and I'll get x to equal, so that's for this one, and I'll get x to equal 3.75. Okay, so the question, we got to go back and read. At what time will it hit the ground? Well, x being 0 is where it's starting. It's starting at the ground level. It's being shot from the ground, right? So if I were to create a parabola, this thing is being shot from the ground at time being 0, and it's landing 3.75 seconds later. Okay, so our answer here would be 3.75 seconds. Okay? All right, so just a few more questions I want to go through, and that will sum everything up here. So let's go over to the next page. Let's look at page 12, and I'm going to take a look at question number 8 to begin. All right, so again, this is on page 12, and we're going to be using factoring here. So again, the whole point is we're going to be solving these quadratics using factoring. We've already learned about the quadratic formula. You guys remembered how to factor, so now we're going to implement those skills. So before we can do anything, we need to always make sure, is this in standard form? Ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0 form. And it is. Here's my a value. Oops, sorry. So my a value is this 3. My b value is 27. There's no c value, and it equals 0. So this is in standard form. So let's factor this and solve the quadratic. Again, when you solve quadratics, it's got to be equal to 0, guys. So first things first, I'm going to take out a 3x. These both have in common a 3x. Now, the difference between question 8, and if I go back to question 5 here, do you remember how I said here, it's okay to divide everything out by 3. Everything. We divided everything out by 3, that GCF. That's only okay if you're dividing everything out by a number. You can divide everything out by a number. There's no variable here. But if you look with question number 8, there's a variable. You cannot divide 0 by a variable. This is wrong. You cannot divide by a variable. So again, I'll repeat that. For question 5, I can divide everything out by 3 because it's a constant, it's a number. There is no variable, there's no x. Okay, that's on page 11. But on page 12, question number 8, I can only divide everything out by 3x and not by 0 because there's a variable attached. So, as we always have done before, we're going to bring that 3x out front. Again, you are not dividing it here. This is wrong. Okay, so let's take out that 3x. And we are left with 3 divided by 3 is 1. X squared over x is just x. 27 over 3 is 9. And x over x is 1. And this is set equal to 0. And now, guys, we can t-chart. Let's t-chart this thing. I'll have 3x equals 0. And I'll have x plus 9 equals 0. And solve for x. Okay, so I'm just following our basic properties of subtraction here. And I'll get x to be 0 and x to be negative 9. All right, so the next question I want to take a look at is question number 15 on page 13. So let's go to question number 15 on page 13. Okay? So this is a Regents question if you want to star this. Okay? And the question is asking which is the solution set of the equation. Okay, so now again, remember, when it's set equal to 0, what's the thing we're supposed to do, guys? If I have x minus 2 is equal to 0, we're actually already set up pretty nice here. What should I be doing next? You want a t-chart. So you're just going to solve for x. You have x minus 2 equals 0, and x minus a equals 0. And get x alone. So I'll have x to equal 2 is one of my solutions, and a to be one of my other solutions. Again, guys, same properties here. If this was x minus 4, you'd add over the 4. So if this is x minus a, you're just adding over the a. So my two values here are 2 and a. And this was a Regents question. I don't know if you want to star that. Okay? All right, so here is actually where I will have completed our lesson, so you can stop the video here. If you want more practice, I'm just going to go through a few more questions here for you if you would like that. So that kind of wraps up this lesson, but if you want some more practice, I'm going to continue with going over questions on page 12 again. And, you know, if you want the practice, you can pay attention. Otherwise, thank you for watching. And I would get started on that homework. It is 4B-3 day 2, and you just have to submit it through Unified Classroom. All right. Have a good day, guys. Alrighty, so those of you that are still listening here, let's go back to page 12. So for page 12, I wanted to go over questions 9, 10, and question 13. Alright, so this is just extra practice for those of you that want it. And 12, sorry. So we have x squared is equal to 12x. Again, whenever you guys solve for the zeros, it needs to be in standard form where it equals 0. So let's do that. We got to subtract over that 12x on both sides. Now, can I combine these terms? No, they're not like terms. So I'll have x squared minus 12x equals 0. Again, we got to take out that GCF first. Whenever you guys factor, the GCF comes out first. So we're going to factor out an x. Now again, remember what I said. You can't divide 0 by a variable. This is wrong. So you're just dividing out by x and bringing it out front. So that x is just going to come out front. And I'll be left with x minus 12 in the parentheses. Okay, and again, guys, all you got to do is just t-chart. X equals 0. And you have x minus 12 equals 0. The addition property of equality on both sides, and I'll get x to equal 12. Okay? Again, question number 10. Is it in standard form? I need ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. It's not equal to 0, so let's subtract over that 16. Now I have x squared minus 16 equals 0. This is one of your favorites. It's a dots problem, so we're going to factor. I'll have x minus 4 and x plus 4. T-chart and solve for x. Again, same exact process. And again, you guys can pause the video, rewind, fast forward, whatever you need. Okay? And these are my values for x, -4 and +4. For question 12, all right, I have to, again, get this in standard form. It's not in standard form, guys. So you got to add over that 3. Now I have x squared plus 4x plus 3 equals 0. This is in standard form now. We can factor. I'm going to double bubble because my leading coefficient is 1. So just double bubble. The two numbers that are going to multiply to 3 but add to 4 are 3 and 1. And then again, T-chart. And solve for those roots. Solve for the roots. You'll get x to be -3 and x to be -1. All right, and lastly, if we take a look at question 13, so I'll blow this one up a little bigger. Question 13, again, guys, gotta be in standard form. You gotta get it equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract over the 30 on both sides. There are no like terms here, so we cannot combine anything. Set it equal to 0, and we're going to factor. Now again, do I have to multiply to the back, rainbow method, and split this, or can I just double bubble? Again, think about it. We can double bubble because this leading coefficient is 1. So I've got an x and an x. What multiplies to -30 but adds to -13? Well, remember, if we're multiplying to -30, one of these got to be minus and the other one has to be plus. A positive times a negative is going to get you to a negative. So our only options here, well, let's think. We've got +15 and -2, or we have -15 and +2. Well, 15 times -2 is -30. Add them together, and that's, ooh, shoot. That's not -13, so that's out. Let's try the next one. -15 times 2 is -30. Add them together. Bingo. Add them together, and they equal -13. So we have -15 and +2. Again, got a T-chart and solve for the roots. Okay, so hopefully you found this video helpful. Again, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to email me, message me on Remind, or using Unified Classroom. All right, so this concludes your first video of many. Again, hopefully you found this helpful. If not, please leave me some feedback if you would like to message me, so that way I can be more helpful to you. All right, have a good day, guys. Bye.